Hi there, this is Paul Colmsey from Seven Sigma, and this is a video about Flow, and in particular using Flow to set permissions in SharePoint lists. This is a common scenario, and in SharePoint Designer it was particularly common because back in the day you might have a workflow or an info path form where you fill in a leave request, for example, and the workflow, the SharePoint Designer workflow, would send a task to your manager to approve that request. Now, because you, the originator, created that task, you have right access to that task. And that created the concern with a lot of organizations that, wait, well, people could self-approve because they could just go straight to that task list and say, yes, I'm approved, and then you bypass the manager and you bypass the process. So it was common to create an app step using SharePoint Designer, which was a way of running privileged operations, and changing permissions is considered a privileged operation. But we were able to achieve the goal of the user creates the task for the manager, but the user can then no longer edit that task. Now, I have a way of doing this in Flow, and for me, it's actually quite straightforward, and I can explain it, but there seems to be a lot of conceptual baggage and background that comes with a lot of this stuff. And for Flow being a tool for power users and citizen developers, some of these topics may not be familiar. Now, rather than me write a big long blog post and cover all bases, I thought I'd record this video and put it to you, the Flow audience, and ask you what you would like me to cover and to what level of detail. So I'm going to cover a high level view of what my flows do, and then I'll wait to hear from you, and based on the feedback, I might write it up into a series of blog posts. So now let's turn our attention to Flow, and I'll put some context to this. I do not have one giant flow here to do permissions on SharePoint lists. In fact, I have split it up into 3 separate flows. And that's the first point. You may not be aware that you can actually do this. It's possible to have one flow call another flow. And that's really handy because that starts to encourage reusability, number one. And it means that some of these flows could do privileged operations and be called by other flows. And that means you get that app step functionality that SharePoint Designer had. Now, conceptually, so you can see here, I've got 2 I've labeled service flows, and 1 set permissions on Coffee Place is the actual flow that is triggered from a SharePoint list, like say when you add a new item to the list. Why I called it Coffee Place, that's just the name of the list that I'm currently working with. So let's have a look conceptually on how this works. I've got a little PowerPoint diagram I've drawn. Okay, so here's what I've done. That's the first flow there, set permissions on Coffee Place. And that's a typical simple flow. It's triggered from SharePoint, you can see there. And in fact, here is SharePoint list 1. Let's pretend this is the list called Coffee Places. And every time someone adds a new coffee place to the list, this flow gets triggered, right? It's using the create item trigger in SharePoint. I only have one action in this flow right now. It's a HTTP action, and it's actually calling one of the other flows and passing it some details. So it's passing it, for example, the list that is being used, the item ID of the newly created item, the ID, the user details of the person who created it, as well as the site collection or site. So some parameters get sent through. Now, why I do this? Well, we're back to that whole encouraging reuse, because for example, if I had another SharePoint list that I also wanted to do permissions on, I can now call that same flow, which I've called a service flow. We can call that same flow, but this would send completely different information to it, and this would then apply this logic to that list as well. So hopefully that makes sense, and that's good principles for reuse. But there's actually an extra layer here, because this particular flow, which I've called the update list item permission flow, this performs a privileged operation. It has to actually break inheritance and change permissions. Now, to do that, because I am now using a HTTP trigger, it doesn't know who triggered this flow. This is almost running anonymously. So now we have to deal with the authentication to SharePoint. So basically we have to get this thing called an access token, which is basically the app says, hey SharePoint, here is my credentials, my app credentials. We're not talking user credentials here. Here are my application credentials. Can you please give me an access token that I can use to perform some things? And because using an access token is quite a common operation, I also decided to put that into its own service flow. So I have a flow over here called get access token. And its job in life is to basically be passed some details. It talks to access control and gets the access token and gives it back to the calling flow. Now, that's quite a lot to take in, but that's the basic pattern of how you do this. Once you get your head around access tokens and OAuth and how that works, there's a whole lot of things that you can do, much more than just change permissions on list. For example, I wrote some blog posts where I update manage metadata columns using a similar technique. But in any event, what that means is I have three flows. It's triggered by this one. This one then quickly passes off to the update list item flow to do the work. Update list item flow can't do anything without getting an access token, so it passes off to the get access token flow, which does its work, comes back, and then we're able to break the existing permission inheritance, apply the new permissions, and then we send the new permission set that's been applied back to the calling flow, just in case we want to display it or log it somewhere or do whatever. So that's the basic conceptual gist. And now I'm going to go back to the flows and give you a quick look, and I'll take you with a high level run through. So first up, let's have a look at the one that triggers from a list, set permissions on coffee place, because this is a pretty easy one. This is a pretty stock flow. You can see here, there it is, when an item is created, right? And the site is my personal development tenant, colmsy.sharepoint.com. And I have a list in here called coffee shop ratings. And in case you're wondering, it was a list I used for existing blog posts. So I was pretty much lazy and just decided to use that one. You can see here though, I've created an action. Now the green symbol tells me it's a HTTP action, and I've renamed it. I say change created by to be or to have read only. Basically, I want to set it so that whoever created this item, they only have read-only permission to that item. So how do I do that? Well, I do a HTTP post to the URL of the service flow. Okay, so this is the magic. In fact, I'm passing it then the item ID of the newly created item. From there, I'm just hard coding that, hey, this is the coffee shop ratings list that you want to deal with. This claim is basically getting the created by details from this trigger. And I'm also passing it the site collection URL so it knows what to do. This URL here that you're looking at here was actually generated when I created the other flow. So let me explain. Close it down. Go back to now this one, service flow, update list item permissions. Let's have a look at this guy. So this is the one that, by the way, if we just do the PowerPoint again to remind you, this is the main one that has a lot of the logic, this stuff here. Okay, so that URL that this one was calling was the URL that this is listening on. Now, so let's have a look at this guy. He does a few things. Okay, scroll up. So first up, it's a HTTP trigger. So this flow is triggered when someone sends it a HTTP request. And so it's going to receive a request from the other flow I just showed you. And the first thing I have to do, so it's going to receive a payload. And I have to initialize a few variables. So I tend to use variables a lot in Flow, but unfortunately variables can't be shrunk into a scope. So you just my flows tend to have a lot of variables up front. Nevertheless, there's a few things I need. So some of these variables I'm not setting right now. I'm just initializing so they exist. So for example, I'm going to use a variable called user principal ID as a string. I'm going to use it later in the flow, but right now I'm not giving it a value. So those two are just initializing variables. I then have to do some things like encoding claims or just manipulating the data that's sent to this flow. I have to do some manipulation of that data in such a way that I can use it for further steps. So that's what some of these steps are. And anyone familiar with OAuth and app principles will pretty much understand exactly what's going on here. This step, called get access token, is when I'm calling the third flow. So this step here, this is another HTTP action. And again, going back to PowerPoint, this is now that bit. I'm now calling this piece to go and get me an access token. Now, I won't cover that for now, but you can be rest assured that if we get a status code back of 200, I know pretty confidently that I've received an access token. So what we're doing here is we've now added a condition that says if we received a token, change the ACL. So if the status is code 200, let's keep going. So let's assume that we got an access token and everything's hunky-dory. Now I have another HTTP call, and now we're getting into the SharePoint REST web service where most of this work is being done. So I'm now having to, first up, call one of the REST web services, passing in the site collection URL from the trigger. So let me just come back up here. Remember, the trigger has the site collection, the item ID, the list name, and the person who created the item. Come back down here. So I'm saying, right, talk to that site collection, talk to the site users web service, pass in the claim that was provided to me, and that will produce something that I need called a user principal ID. And that's now being set as a variable. So I am taking the payload of this or the return of this, extracting one bit that I need, and I'm setting it into a variable called user principal ID. Now, those of you that understand SharePoint REST web services will also know what this means, particularly if you've used the SharePoint REST web service to do permission work. I also need to remember that I'm going to basically replace all the existing permissions with the person who created it's going to have read access, and the site owners group is going to have full control. So how do I get the site owners group? Well, once again, there's a web service for that. And this time it's called associated owners group, right? And so if I talk to that web service, and by the way, I'm passing it in this authorization header, I'm passing it a bearer token. That bearer token, that is the access token that was provided by the other flow. So that basically says, yes, the site owners group for this particular site collection is this group. And so that then gets added to this variable here. So I now have something called a principal ID, both for the user who created this new item in the SharePoint list, as well as the site owners group. Now that I have those two pieces of information, I can go ahead and break permission inheritance on this newly created item. Once again, I'm doing a post HTTP connection. I'm talking to the SharePoint list web service here. I'm passing it the list ID from the trigger. I'm passing it the item ID from the trigger, and then I'm calling this break role inheritance. And if you look closely there, you can see that I've got something called copy role assignments, and I'm setting that to false. The second parameter, clear subscopes, you can ignore. That doesn't really apply when we're working with list items. That only applies with sites and lists. But the role assignments equals false. Basically what that does, those of you in SharePoint that have ever gone to a list or a SharePoint item and gone break inheritance from the parent, by default, it makes a copy of the parent ACLs or the parent permissions, and then it's up to you to change them. What this does, if role assignments is true, that would behave the way SharePoint does. But role assignments false literally wipes out all existing permissions. And so I'm basically wiping the, so first up, I break the permission inheritance and I basically say wipe out any existing permissions, don't want to see them. That then, I'm able to then go, cool, I've broken the permission inheritance. So now I actually go and grab, in fact, that's an irrelevant task, I'll take that one out. Then I go and add a permission in for the site owners group, which was this guy, the site owners group principal. So once again, I'm talking to the SharePoint list web service, the REST web service, and I'm going and finding this item. I'm going to the role assignments and I'm using an add role assignment, and it's asking for a principal ID, and that's the site owner's principal ID that I used earlier. Now this role ID, by the way, this value is actually simply a value that specifies whether it's full control, contribute, or read. They're just identifiers. So there you can hard code those if you know the permission. I want full control for site owners. So if you have a look, it's 1073 741829. 1073 741829. So this is the adding full control. Once again, I got to send it the authorization token for this to all happen. Now I do it for the current user. So this time I hit the exact same web service endpoint, which is this add role assignment, and then I'm passing in the read-only assignment this time. And so if that works, and it does, at that point I go, right, just go and actually give me the new ACL, give me the new set of permissions for that particular item. So once again, I hit the web service and I just say, just give me the current role assignments, and I then I send that data back to whoever called this particular flow. So that in a nutshell is the process by which you can change permissions on an item, a bit like the way the app step works in SharePoint Designer. Now, just to close off things, because I super rushed through that, but you can now see why I'm loath to blog this until I get some feedback from the community. Let's have a look at this access token really quickly. So what's going on here? So just to help you recall, what I just showed you was basically all of this process, right? Going and breaking an inheritance, applying new permissions and returning a new permission set. What about generating this access token in the first place that gives me the authorization to do this? Well, those of you that have done a little bit of SharePoint-y kind of application development work would know that you can go to any given site collection and you can register a new app principal. So this little page here allows you to create this client ID, client secret, and some other information. And once you've registered an app, you can then actually tell SharePoint what rights this app has on your environment. And you can then trust that app to, you basically, for a given site collection, you add that app and it says, do you trust this app to do stuff? And you say yes. And at that point, the access token will allow, the valid access token will allow me to do whatever rights have been granted to this app. So, in a nutshell, this one does this. So what happens? He receives a HTTP request, that makes sense. I've also passed some information to this one. I've passed in the app client ID, tenant ID, and a client secret. And that piece, those three pieces of information, the way OAuth works, is needed to issue the access token. So a bit like the variables, just to manipulate the data in the way I need. Finally, I then talk to, I'm not talking to SharePoint now, you can notice I'm actually talking to accounts.accesscontrol.windows.net. I'm passing in my tenant ID and I'm saying, give me an OAuth token, thank you. And in the body of this HTTP request, at that point, I'm saying I'm after a client credentials grant. Here's my client ID, here's my client secret, here's my resource, which is all built from these variables. And all things going to plan, I end up with an access token that comes back, which I then send in the response. Hence why, if I go back to my set permissions on update list item permission flow, the get access token, okay, the output of that is the access token because that's what gets returned from that particular flow. Okay, now the net result is it works really well. Let me demonstrate. If I go to my little coffee shop ratings, and you can see I've put some sample coffee things in here, let's actually go and make a new one. And so we make a new item, and the new item is, I don't know, rocket fuel coffee. And let's say we really like rocket fuel coffee. It's a 9 out of 10. What beans is rocket fuel coffee using? It doesn't really matter for the purposes of what we're doing, but hey, let's just go with it anyway. Let's say we're using some beans from the USA called Death Wish coffee. By the way, they really exist. And let's save that. Okay, that new item has been created. Now if we go back and have a look at the flows, let's see the effect of what's happened. Okay, let's go and have a look at the first set permissions on coffee place flow, because that's the one that triggers from SharePoint. And as you can see, that ran 14 seconds ago and succeeded. Let's have a look. Here's set permissions when an item is created. It was from my correct site. There's rocket fuel coffee, there's my rating, and there's some other bits and pieces from this thing. Lovely, very happy with that. So what then happened? Well, we then called, whoopsie, I want to go back in there. We then called the other service flow. What information did we pass to it? Well, we passed the item ID. This one is now item 55. We said it was the coffee shop ratings list. We've passed the claim detail of my account that did it and the site collection URL. Awesome. Let's now go and have a look at the service flow. So the service flow now, which is this one, update list item permission, let's see if it worked. And it succeeded. Let's have a look at the history. So it received a request from my other flow, and you can see that here was the stuff that was passed in, exactly what we would expect to see. Wonderful. We then initialize some variables. We don't need to see that stuff. We then go off and get an access token from the other service flow, and that's fantastic. And if we received a token, which really is, that really should say if we got a 200 okay, Now we come in and do some stuff. So now we're doing a get user details, and we're calling some of those other web services that I mentioned, the SharePoint REST web services, and we're passing it. It's hiding the bearer token, but it's passing the authentication, and we know it's worked because we have a big happy tick here. So remember that I wanted the user principal ID, and I put it into a variable. So if we have a look, the user principal ID is number 11. That's me. Cool. What about the site collection group? Well, we go off and we talk to the REST web service and we put that into a variable. And it turned out the principal ID for the site collection owners group is number 6. Cool. ID number 6. Now we went and broke permission inheritance, and that worked. Then we add the role assignment for the site owners group. And again, you'll see here that we're calling the web service, we're passing in the correct ID, we're then passing in the principal ID, and we're giving it its role, and it basically came back and said, yep, I'm happy. So we've applied the permission for the owners group and the current user, and finally we use the get role assignments to basically see what came back. So I've done a call to the REST web service saying basically for item 55, please give me the role assignments and the member details, which just expands the information. And if we have a look at the body here, we can see that the 2 role assignments now, or the 2 access control entries, number 6, which is team site owners, has full control. And number 11, which is me, I only have read access. To double check that, we can go back in and have a look at the one we just did. I might have to refresh it, being a flow. Cool. Rocket Fuel Coffee. If we have a look, and we can get pretty much an idea straight away if we have a look over here, I can see already there's only 2 access control entries on this item. Whereas I, for example, go to one of the other ones that I created the other day, I have 8 because they're still set to inherit. And let's actually go in and have a look. Manage access. You can see, there you go, team site, me, under advanced. The old way of looking at it, you can see that I have read permission and the team site owners has full control. I am a site collection administrator of this site, which is why I can still get to it. All right. So as you can see, there is a lot of territory to cover. In fact, just to kind of sum up for you, these are the key concepts that really, if you know these, this stuff is pretty easy, but of course you got to know them. So first up, what are the key principles or key concepts? Number 1, understanding app principles and how OAuth works for SharePoint. So basically how an app can authenticate to SharePoint so you don't have to run as a particular user and deal with service accounts and all of that sort of stuff. Then there's this concept of service flows where you can actually break up your flows into reusable components. And hopefully I've shown you how that can be done. Then of course there's all the intricacies of the SharePoint REST web services, which is what we were talking to just then to set all of the permissions, and they have some of their own quirks and some of their own aspects to them. Then of course there's the actual HTTP action in Flow, which is an advanced action. It's sort of the advanced flow scenario, but it's incredibly powerful because it allows you to talk to pretty much any web service endpoint you want. And related to that is then creating your own flows that are based on request response triggers, which pretty much means your flow is a HTTP web service that's called by HTTP actions. And the other aspect is workflow definition language itself. There was a few little bits of trickery in some of these flows to extract the certain things that I needed from the various payloads from each of the different steps. So to write this up for what seems like a fairly simple scenario is a lot of work. So please give me some feedback. Let me know what you think. Let me know the topics I should cover. It's crazy that it's taken me 20 minutes just to even explain all of this. So imagine what it would take to actually write it all up. So hope to hear from you soon, and hopefully that flow gave you some ideas just from the brief view that I went through.